As we watch the participants grow here, we'll be starting very shortly. And thank you, everybody, and welcome to this to today's webinar with KPMG and APMA. And give us a minute, and we'll be starting. So thank you once again, everybody, for participating in our efforts to navigate the CUSMA for automotive industry executives. Those of you who have been with us before know that we've spent the last 3 years negotiating a new agreement in a negotiation that Canada did not ask for, in a term negotiation that was cantankerous, with our best friends to the south and our other close friends just south of them. And we spent 3 years talking about regional value content. We talked about products that should be included for compliance. We talked about metals. We talked about reporting. We talked about de minimis. Talked about all the little things that are important to those of us who actually are on the ground trading within this space, making parts, shipping them, making parts in one country, shipping them to the other two, and everything in between. Whether you're in volume parts, whether you're in tools, whether you're in logistics, the world is changing in this space. With us today from KPMG, we have Nott, who specializes in trade and customs. We have David Francescucci, who is the national leader for transfer pricing and value chain management. Whitaker, who specializes in international tax, and Jérôme Thirion, who is the national leader for supply chain. We're going to talk about the realities of business today. I mean, without getting too formal about it, we are in an unprecedented time, especially in relations to the United States and all the partnerships that the United States has external to the USMCA. There's the CUSMA launch that in other trade negotiations, we'd negotiate for 7 years in the TPP, and then you'd have a launch date that's in a year and a half that you prepare for it. Well, the CUSMA and the USMCA had a very quick entry into force. And so we've got the debate between entry into force and enforcement. There's a pace of change within the industry, both from a technological point of view, which in part caused the automotive, caused for the angst in the automotive negotiations. And we've got a American government that has a different view on world trade, the role of the WTO and its relationships with major partners like China. Today's news, you don't have to look too much further than today's news. The American government has expelled Chinese representation in Houston, closing their consulate, and they've got 3 days to get out. You think that is going to have no effect on the automotive business? We're here to tell you. We're here to tell you that you should watch a little closer. Where are sales going post-COVID? When is post-COVID? What is post-COVID? How does that change your planning? All of these things are very important. We're going to compare the current model with alternatives. We will be talking about training course details. Look, over the next few weeks, we intend to offer training courses on the CUSMA implementation. Of course, there'll be beginners courses that talk really about whether goods qualify or not. But it is a great course for those who have little or no background on the deal. But there will also be intermediate course, which is cover what has changed. You're working in an AFTA world and you're working in a CUSMA world. What's going to change? And we've got seasoned practitioners who are going to focus on what's new in that CUSMA world and how that's going to affect how you source, sell, report, comply. no further ado, I'd like to bring in Joy Nott, who is a good friend of the APMA, but also a very seasoned practitioner in importing and exporting from Canada. And we're very lucky to have her in the family and at KPMG. Joy?
Thank you, Flavio. So, you know, I think you just hit all the high notes, and I invite my other co-speakers this morning to just, what we'd like to do is have a roundtable discussion about the fact that, you know, I think 2020, to say that 2020 is an unusual year for a whole bunch of different reasons is definitely a fair statement. Putting COVID-19 aside, you know, as Flavio said, on April 24th, it was decided that, you know, that the official levers were pulled to put the new CUSMA trade agreement in place on July 1st. That's an unprecedented timeline to go from April 24th to July 1st to know the rules are changing. We're now on the 22nd of that month. We're 22 days in, so 3 weeks into the new trade agreement. And I think it's fair to say that there's still a lot of scrambling, because obviously I don't need to tell this audience, a lot of companies were closed down or at least shut down their good chunks of their production because of COVID-19. If they didn't go to skeleton staff, they were potentially closed completely. And then opening up again in a very different world, in a different environment with social distancing and PPE and, you know, hand sanitizers and all the rest of it, it's changed our reality. But if you put all of that aside for a moment, you know, things were already at a breakneck pace. So, you know, that's on the free trade side of the house. You know, Dot, David, I know that there's also been a lot of, you know, tax discussions globally, and specifically between the United States and Canada, because we have such a tight relationship. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that. Dot, David, there you go.
So I can tell you from a U.S. perspective, you know, the last time we actually had a U.S. tax reform was Ronnie Reagan, and I happened to be around for that. And that took several years to put together, right? The Trump administration has a new initiative, whether you agree with it or not, is to bring jobs and manufacturing and other services back to the United States. And they put together a U.S. tax reform in December of 2017 that became effective on 1/1/18, and certain other provisions were postponed and were waiting on regulations. But it took them 6 to 7 weeks to put together a huge package, which was quite different than what we've seen before, right? It was a Christmas package, and then another year later, they gave us regulations on several of those very unique features, where they're basically bringing down our U.S. tax rates. They're providing incentives for different activities to be done in the U.S., exported from the U.S. They put sticks if you tend to do things outside the U.S. And so it was something that was quite interesting to get that together in a 6-week period between what the administration wanted, get through the House, the Senate, and have an overall execution. And we are still getting big package at accelerated rate of regulations that explain the different intent and provisions today. We also had, just on the state side as well, we went from, you know, a Wayfair in June of 18. We had a Quill decision that told us how we taxed or was allowed to tax, from a sales tax and a state income tax, for over 25 years. We have a June 2018, you know, Supreme Court decision that basically takes that paradigm and wipes it out. And now we have new economic thresholds rather than bricks and mortar thresholds as the basis to tax. So the U.S. in itself has been accelerated more than I've ever seen in my 30 plus years of career. And it's fun, but it does make it quite challenging for anybody who's trying to conduct their business to see what it is they're going to be taxed and how they're going to be taxed on a going forward basis.
And I think that was the Wayfair decision that you were referring to, right? That basically took the Quill previous paradigm that had been in place for so long, and it's the Wayfair case that kind of took it, right? Am I right on that?
Yes.
Yeah, there you go. So David, Jérôme, like what are your thoughts on what you're seeing, whether it be in supply chain or David, value chain and other aspects of tax?
Yeah, so certainly, Jérôme, I can go ahead just following Dot. I think Dot sort of you summarized pretty well the U.S. Tax reform and the situation over there. I think it's important for all of you to realize that it's not only a U.S. thing, right? I mean, there's been tax reform at an unprecedented pace around the world. So the major countries came up with new pieces of tax legislation. And some form of reform of their tax systems. I mean, you won't be surprised to hear that tax authorities around the world are competing for the same dollars. And when the U.S. Makes it very loud and clear that their intention is to bring back jobs to the U.S. And force companies to maybe re-domicile certain activities to the U.S. Well, foreign tax authorities don't like that. They don't like that. Why? Because they're losing jobs, they're losing foreign direct investment, they're losing tax dollars, and you need to expect a tough fight. And they are fighting back. So all the things we'll be discussing today, what Jérôme will be talking about, what sort of trends we're seeing from a supply chain or operating model perspective, creates a lot of tension in an international tax setting. We've had some important reform as well from a transfer pricing perspective, where right now the international rules that govern how companies are basically allocating profits among various countries, those rules now dictate that those profits are to be aligned where value is being created along the supply chain. So depending on which activities are performed in which country, this is what you use for the purposes of allocating profits within a multinational to the various countries where you're doing business. And it's no longer as simple as saying, well, we're putting contracts in place that govern how those profits are allocated between the various countries. So actually where significant economic activities are performed, are they in the US, are they elsewhere, are they in Canada, Mexico, are they in China or elsewhere? These key decisions that will have an impact on, supply chain strategies and operating model have very, very important sort of tax repercussions. So we'll see that whereas tax is rarely seen as a driver for meaningful business decisions, it is more and more becoming an imperative to consider tax when making those decisions, because the consequences of not proactively considering the impact of taxes, especially if you operate in more than one country, are just so large that they could negate any benefits of pursuing a supply chain strategy or operating model.
Yeah.
And moving intangibles between countries today is quite complicated. You have exit taxes that we didn't have before.
Yep.
So when you are looking at the drivers of the function and risks and where the value is created, you have to look at these intangibles. And different countries are reacting to that because they know that different, like you said, we're all taking that pie and trying to divide it up and tax it in different jurisdictions, and others are trying to prevent you from leaving. Right?
Correct.
Save
Yep.
incentives from coming and prevention from leaving, whether it be limitations on your trade or limitations from a tax perspective, is ongoing right now, which makes it quite complicated for today's environment.
So I think there's a perfect segue here for Jérôme, because what I see is a balancing act. You have to consider all where that value in the is in the value chain, as you brought up, David, as to which country where that's happening from a transfer pricing perspective. That's weighing in more. You've also got the rules of origin that determine which country things happen in to determine whether or not something actually qualifies. If you're going to be looking at making supply chain changes, there's the exit taxes and stuff. And then of course there's that whole reality of the new tax regime in the United States. So Jérôme, I don't know what you're seeing like from a supply chain planning perspective. What kind of questions, what sort of things are people looking at that you're hearing about?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Joy. And the result of the current context, which is uncertainty, has a big impact on supply chain, obviously. So there are 3 or 4 things that we see happening in organization today in terms of refocus, if you will, in the supply chain. I mean, the first one, because of uncertainty, is the demand signal. So how much of those parts, how many of those I'm going to sell. The OEM are certainly like the tier 1 and the tier 2 in our our colleagues in the industry on the call are all generally scratching their head is what is the demand looks like, right? So the demand signals are changing. We see our client focusing quite a bit on trying to figure out what is going to be the new demand signals, what is the trigger, and where is my data, and how do I share this data with my OEM or my tier 2 or tier 3 upstream, downstream. So that's the first thing that we see our clients really putting a lot of focus on. And you have now access to some AI analytics solution, which actually helping here. The other point is what you just mentioned, though, is really about the cost equation. What is the decomposition of my BOM, and where do I buy and where do I sell? I mean, stating the obvious, but the second aspect is really we see clients refocusing on the cost equation and preparing for something we don't really know quite yet, but which is going to have some sort of an impact on the margin at some point. And it could be positive if the Canadian organization see fit. They may actually grow the Canadian business as a result, or they may move some of this business, in Mexico more than that we have today. So that's the second aspect. And I would say a couple of other things that we see happening at clients is the supplier risk component. So some of the downstream vendors are going to be or are already for some of them maybe in more difficult situation. So this needs to be known and addressed, and not all organizations are actually ready to have I would say a package process, if you will, or ready to go process in order to deal with supplier risk and supplier uncertainty. So we see our clients really moving into this area, which is a little bit untapped today, because it's been done knowing who is a supplier we're working with, but it's not been done in a systematic way. So the systematic process is being put in place now.
Yeah, and that actually brings, talking about the systematic processes. I know from, I've been in the business for over 35 years, and you take a look, and the original NAFTA, when you think about it, it came out in 1994 prior to the advent of the internet available for non-military purposes. So the old NAFTA was traditionally managed using Excel spreadsheets and sort of very manual type processes, and the pace of change when it comes to technology, I think, and the complexity of everything that's happening, it's like the Rubik's Cube is literally shifting in every direction all at once. I think technology needs to play a larger role maybe in this free trade space than it has traditionally. Yeah. And I just want to point out two other things. So, there's Flavio was talking earlier about having some uncertainty, just the general uncertainty in the marketplace. And there's, again, talk of Section 232 tariffs, for steel that are still floating in the ether. And we thought that we had nailed that one, wrestled it to the ground and killed it, but apparently not. It's back. And it's sort of floating around in the ether. And then something that I just wanted to also raise, because in the automotive industry, I see technology, the car of the future is not going to be the car that I grew up with in the 70s. It's already got a lot of computerization that's under the hood, but I think that high tech is actually going to make its way more like onto the dashboard. And Flavio could comment on this more than me, is self-propelled vehicles and all the rest of it. And something interesting that's happening in the world of trade overall is that the Chinese are looking at their export control regime, and they're basically emulating the US export control regime, which, for those of you who deal in anything that's high tech, any sort of technology that's considered to be, fitting in a certain sphere of importance, I think the day is going to come when where you make things is not only going to have the cost that Jérôme was talking about, you know, that the tax implications on where the value chain aspects happen that David was talking about. And then of course, because most of us sell into the United States, those US tax concerns that Dott alluded to, you're also going to have another layer put on top of it to say, what are the trade regulations about being able to move something because of the technology in it between these various countries? Because the final thing that I'll say on this slide is, you know, that lower left-hand corner, the number of countries who are taking trade actions against other countries, because trade now is being used as a lever to that point that David was speaking about, where all those governments are fighting for that same tax dollar, right? So you've got that tension that's happening at the OECD, and you've got it happening at the WTO. And the upper right-hand corner, the shortage of talent and labor stresses. So there's a two-edged sword there in my mind. There's the fact that if you take a look at all of this, I have yet to meet in my life a single human who is an expert on tax, an expert on trade, an expert on supply chain, an expert on the geopolitics of things. And if that person exists, please introduce me. I'd love to meet them. So you've got the reality of management having to look at all these things simultaneously, when that's not necessarily the mix of decision triggers that have been traditionally on the table. So there's a new learning process for management. And then, you know, labor stresses overall. I've heard that as soon as next month, the United States could be taking action or again, you know, challenging Mexico on some of the labor requirements that are required under CUSMA. So, you know, moving along, I just wanted to very quickly hit the highlights of some of the things that I think management needs to be thinking about as it relates to CUSMA. First of all, there's the rules of origin. I'm not going to say more than that. I'm sure if you're listening to this call today, you certainly are aware of the fact that, as Flavio alluded to, for the past 3 years, the automotive rules of origin have been front and center, not only in the middle of negotiation tables between Canada and the States, they've been headline news, you know, for a lot of that time. So as we all know, those rules are going to get tougher and tougher over the next 4 years, and that the incremental requirement is rising a little bit each one of the 4 years. Then you've got the consequences of the North American steel, and I didn't put it here, but steel and aluminum requirements, where that's coming down the road, where, you know, in 7 years' time, the definition of North American steel is going to mean that it was melted and poured here. And, you know, we'll speak in a minute about how quickly that actually is, and when the reality of trying to set up supply chains and make decisions today about something that you know is coming down the road. Something else that's new about this particular agreement that didn't exist in NAFTA is that there is a sunset clause. This agreement expires in 16 years, and we've agreed as the 3 countries that we're going to sit down every 6 years and you know, do a big refresh. And if all 3 countries agree every 6 years to reset the 16-year timer, great. But the old NAFTA didn't have that expiry. So while I think it's unlikely that this particular agreement will expire in 16 years, that's a business reality. There's an end date. The labor value content. This is the first trade agreement that I'm aware of that actually mandates how much a minimum you have to pay somebody in order to make something qualify. That's brand new in trade agreements, right? Normally it was a bill of material, and labor was a factor that got counted in, but you weren't mandated to pay a certain dollar amount. We've already talked to the supply chain disruptions that people are going to have to go through because of this trade agreement and COVID-19. I've already talked about the new export control regime in China, and of course you heard Dott talking about the U.S. tax reform and everything that the U.S. is doing. And I think, you know, my personal opinion is I think that will go beyond this particular administration. I think that there's a ball that started rolling, and no matter who wins the next US election, I think that we're still in for high levels of change for the foreseeable future, because it's just the way the world is running. So I'm going to stop there and sort of open the floor again, and I'm going to invite my co-speakers to sort of now talk about the various strategies that people should be thinking about. I mean, alternate sourcing and that sort of thing. So David, maybe I'll turn to you to sort of open it up with you know, how some of these things maybe touch again on some tax planning. But
Yeah, so maybe Jérôme, I mean, before we get into some of the tax aspects, because you would have gathered from my earlier comments that these on the previous slides, there's a lot of catalysts for change. It's going to prompt a number of changes that will be initiated to sort of be mindful of these new requirements and this new agreement, and it's certainly a significant undertaking, which will have some tax repercussions. But I think that Jérôme, just at a high level, you want to walk through, you know, maybe as you and I have done it on a number of other sort of projects with clients, you know, in terms of sort of the lay of the lands and what are the main elements that are being considered, and sort of the business imperatives to consider certain of those changes, and then sort of quite naturally from a tax perspective, I'll give you an overview of some of the key considerations, and you'll see there's not a shortage of tax consideration when we tackle those issues. Does that make sense, Jérôme?
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted. Yeah.
Hear me?
There we
I am
go.
unmuted? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. So no, absolutely, David. I guess what Joy was, I'm going to start with what Joy was alluded to in a previous slide, which is maybe a little bit of a state in the obvious, but that needs to be completed for everyone here on the call, which is the analysis of the rules of CUSMA, right? And the requalification or qualification of the parts based on this new set of rules. So that's obviously has to be done ASAP. And based on the diagram we have in front of us, and what I just say in terms of requalification of the parts or validation of, you want to do a few things, right? So you want to do a quick analysis of your baseline, which is where do we source from, what is the split of the BOM, obviously for critical part and material, with the impact that we discussed above. Where is manufacturing and assembly taking place? So our on-site, supplier site, where do we cross border? Dot was referring to the crisscross of the parts that we have in this business. So we need to understand that. What is the customer service level that we actually being engaged with? So a little bit of a baseline needs to be done very quickly, if not already. Obviously, you know your business, and intuitively you know what to do, but a little more put on paper we actually help to do the next step, which is, okay, so from there, where are we going? And what are the few scenarios that I can do modeling for, which actually help from both a manufacturing, sourcing, manufacturing, distribution, and resulting into maybe a new forecasting and finance or business case model for certain parts. So I will open with that, David, and I'm going to chime in on the comment you have on the tax layer. But I will strongly recommend that would be the step one, if not already done, for everyone on the call here.
And I think that as people define sort of the baseline and deepen their understanding of the rules and the requirements from CUSMA, I think that people need to recognize that with a baseline sort of, I'll call it supply chain or even value chain, there's typically a legal entity structure or rather tax strategy. If you're sourcing in a specific country, you may decide to have people that will help with local sourcing in Asia. It may be quality control. So from a supply chain perspective, you have a certain need because you need to be close to suppliers in certain instances or customers. And then with that need comes the need to have people on the ground, needs to have a legal entity or local presence. There may be some tax advantages to selecting a jurisdiction, and often there are. especially if you look at sourcing in Asia or what have you. And so as you define the baseline and you look at various alternative scenarios, for instance, if you're changing your supplier base from Asia and you bring it to a different country, well, invariably, this will have an impact on your boots on the ground, right? I mean, if your supplier base is now shifting to North America, you don't really need your sourcing people over in Asia or your quality control people over in Asia. The same thing if one is considering doing like a shift in the manufacturing footprint, right? I mean, stop manufacturing in one country and bring those activities in North America, for instance. And if we take just those examples, once again, it goes to giving you a very concrete example of, you know, a certain decision that's being contemplated to move from the baseline to a future state model to deal with certain requirements under CUSMA. And then what have you realized is there will be inevitably, if that's what you're contemplating, a shift, you know, a footprint shift, you will inevitably be facing the situation that you're leaving a country and you're sort of establishing yourself in another country. So the departing country is not going to be all happy with what you're doing because they're losing sort of, you know, tax revenues, whether it's sort of wage taxes, whether it's corporate income taxes, and they may try to recoup that through, you know, an exit charge. You know, they'll say, you know what, you've been operating in our country for a number of years, we used to pay taxes, and we think that this decision, yes, is granted is a business decision, but, you know, the result for us is a net loss of a business opportunity, and will impose a tax on it. So that's why some of those decisions may be very, very costly when not sort of managed adequately.
Yeah. And I will add maybe one thing, David, which is the business case of repatriating, right? So we've been working with some client who actually made the business case of coming back from, in fact, in that particular case, from China into Canada, the US, and Mexico, a customer service advantage. Because basically you cut your external manufacturing, I mean, outside North America. You don't have your parts on water for 8 weeks. So your inventory is getting really closer to customer. And your service delivery is going to get better as a result, which was, for some clients we've been working with, one of the significant business case in terms of a differentiator. So it could also play very positively, depending on obviously which part of the chain you are in. But I know for this particular client, I have in mind that this play a big deal to the board in order to be able to play this as a differentiator, better customer service level, being quicker to the market.
Yeah, and I would agree that, you know, business drivers should be what we're looking at, like whether it's a customer differentiation, it's better service, better access to suppliers, but you do need to model the tax events so that you don't get to the traps of the unwary, whether it's an exit tax, and then when you have boots on the ground in a new country and whatever function you're having, what are you remunerating? Yeah. How are you legally doing it? Do you need cash in that country? Is your debt to equity? What are you going to do when you do that legal? How do you repatriate cash? How do you get cash? What do you have from a payroll perspective? What do you have from a provincial tax and indirect tax? Maybe you're looking at maquiladoras. Each one of those types of scenarios will have a different tax footprint that needs to be modeled and looked at with all the other business drivers to see which one would affect the greater amount of positivity to your bottom line. And not doing a full vetting of that will cause you some issues. And CUSMA is determining, like you said, both the labor content, the origin of, you know, the origin of product content, the steel content, and what does it mean to have North American steel. Those items as you're conducting a change in your business is not something you do quickly. So you need to know what your baseline is. You need to know how nimble you are and how you're going to get to that such that you reach the duty level that you're comfortable with your margins.
And it's interesting because in the world of international trade, lines are also sort of getting blurred in that there's a recent case in the United States where Chinese components were going into Mexico and being assembled, and that assembly that happened in Mexico qualified for NAFTA, and the goods went into the United States duty-free. However, in the United States, they have something called Section 301 tariffs, which are tariffs on Chinese imported goods that fall into certain categories that are enumerated. I won't say more than that, but there's a big long list of things that attract these Section 301 tariffs. And what was very interesting, and this is what I mean when the lines of international trade now are fudging and smudging, traditionally you would look at the CUSMA rules of origin and you would say, well, if it qualifies, we took the Chinese parts, we brought them into Mexico, we assembled, and it qualified under, in the case I'm talking about, it was NAFTA, but it wasn't that long ago. It qualifies for the free trade agreement, but the US government found that there was still too high a threshold of Chinese, so it was duty-free in normal duties, but Section 301 duties came in on top, and they charged the 10% of Section 301 duties because the government determined there was still too much Chinese content in this particular case. So that's an unprecedented kind of finding in international trade. I've been doing this kind of stuff for a very long time. Normally, if you have manufacturing processes in a particular country where there's a free trade agreement and it passes the rule of origin, you're good. Right? You've deferred duties. Things are getting a little bit more complicated. And I don't think that some of those trade tensions between the United States and China, again, no matter who is in power in the United States, the Pandora's box has been opened. And I think the competition between the United States and China is here to stay. Without even touching on, you know, sort of what's happening with Europe and the fact that the UK is breaking away from Europe and what that's doing to supply chains in the automotive industry. If you're dealing with you know, the German and the UK supply chains coming into North America, you know, there's a whole other thing that's happening over there. So, but I just wanted to quickly, sorry.
Joy, sorry, yeah, no, I was just going to ask you, in fact, and maybe we going to come to this all together in this slide, but how much time do we have to take action? So from a supply chain standpoint, obviously you have some time, you need some time ahead of you in order to change things, tweak things, move a supplier out. So it's you're talking about at best a number of weeks, but probably more a number of months. So on the from a CUSMA standpoint, what does that mean?
So it's interesting because CUSMA actually started on July 1st. So we're 22 days into it, but I can tell you that a lot of the clients that I've been speaking to over the past, 18 months or so, there was a lot of wait and see because these trade negotiations, and again, this is an area that Flavio can certainly attest to because he was intimately involved with them, but the trade negotiations were anything but traditional trade negotiations. And there was ups and downs and all kinds of, drama around them. So I know a lot of companies adopted a wait and see. Let's wait till the dust settles to see where this actually lands before they start pulling triggers and making decisions, only to have it not turn out the way we thought that the negotiations were going to turn out. So for a lot of them, they're looking now at those kinds of things, or they maybe started like a few months ago, but they didn't start a few years ago. They started a few months ago. So to your point, Jérôme, these kinds of decisions are not, and these kinds of changes are not made in the snap of a finger.
Yeah.
The amount of planning that it takes, and that's sort of what this slide, was a perfect segue, because that's what this slide is sort of trying to do. I spoke earlier about a single person having all of the internal knowledge and experience to try and level this out. This is not a sole tax play. It's not a sole trade and customs play. It's not a sole supply chain or value chain play. You have to look at these things simultaneously and look at all the various factors, as Dot was saying in my mind, to look at all the various factors, because you can't just drive it based on, you know, a rule of origin, or you can't just drive it based on supply chain cost, or let tax, you know, drive the bus, because any one of those alone can potentially, I think, lead to a place where you didn't mean to end up.
Yeah, and is there some sort of a grace period from the legislator from July 1st?
There is, but it's like so it's very unofficial. So let me tell you about the 3 countries. So in Canada, there's technically no grace period because the Canadian government has not formally come out and actually said anything along those lines. Same thing with Mexico. The Mexican government has not come out and actually put in writing or even said verbally anywhere that there's a grace period. In the United States, they have acknowledged both verbally directly from US Customs and to a more limited degree USTR. They have held meetings and they've held, you know, informational webinars and stuff where they've said that for the first 6 months between July 1st and December 31st, they're going to, the law is the law and they're going to enforce it. However, they're going to sort of, they recognize the fact that between COVID-19 and plants just starting up again, and the fact that there was such a short runway to get up on this, that they're going to ease up on the enforcement, and they'll use enforcement opportunities as an opportunity to teach and to get feedback from industry and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, if they see any flagrant, you know, disregard for the law, penalties and that kind of stuff are still very much on the table.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, so from a timing standpoint, you've got 6 months with where they're saying, we'll take it easy on you for 6 months. Canada and Mexico have said nothing, but I think both of them are sort of the same mindset. It doesn't bode well for them as a government to come down like a ton of bricks on companies and demand something when they, in a COVID-19 environment, when they know, you know, industry is already under the gun and dealing with numerous challenges. It doesn't, no government is going to benefit from, you know, taking a tough stance.
Yeah.
But that's 6 months. I don't need to tell you guys, 6 months.
Yeah, it snaps very quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Blink.
And also in 6 years, what occurs in 6 years? Because it's a 16-year sunset, but in 6 years, isn't there some uncertainty on that time frame as well from all 3 governments?
Absolutely, because when they sit down again, so we know for a fact, no matter what happens in the next US election, it's more likely than not that in 6 years, it'll be a different administration that's sitting at the table on the US side of and likely in Mexico and Canada as well, right? We all have federal elections between now and 6 years from now. So it'll be a different group of people sitting down representing those 3 countries. And again, what are those negotiations going to look like? What's going to be the sort of in the ether, the air, the attitude towards repatriating, whether it be Make America Great Again or any of those things? What's going to be the general? None of us know, right? So that's a great point, Dot. So, you know, I think with this slide, what we were trying to say here is basically having to look at all these things at the same time. You know, and I'd just be curious to hear from all of you when you're talking to your clients. You know, is there the recognition that all these things are sort of connected? Because I know when I'm talking to my clients, there's maybe a recognition that trade and customs and supply chain, right? Because those 2 things are kind of obvious. Where am I buying stuff from to make sure that it meets the rule of origin so that I actually, you know, my goods will qualify.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that, you know, the value chain, for example, David, is something, when you're talking to people about value chain, are they sort of connecting these dots with the trade agreement, or what would you?
I think they are. I think part of the challenge is in many organizations, the trade and customs people don't report into tax. They report separately. So I think that a very experienced and skilled head of tax will understand. The only way to make this work on a project like this is if you have very strong executive sponsors where the CFO would say the equivalent of COO are at the table, because along this framework of analysis, the key inputs, the analysis, the outputs, it's not only trade and customs, to your point. I mean, if you look at the key inputs, you know, a sophisticated tax tax executive will say, you know what, I'll give you as input my own tax pain points, my transfer pricing pain points, my international tax pain point, the impact of international tax reform. I need to fix this. This is not sustainable. So you're adding to the list of requirements alongside the CUSMA sort of changes, alongside service level supply chain consideration. And if you have strong executive sponsors, that's how you make sure that you get to align all these dimensions in the framework of analysis.
Yep. And I would say the biggest thing that we have to say when we're doing projects on tax consulting that might be one box out of all these that's necessary is, you know, when you're in real estate, you would say location, location, location. Now we say modeling, modeling, modeling. And not just from a tax perspective, from a supply chain perspective, from a payroll perspective, from a, you know, an administrative burden perspective, and what is the tax impact when those major decisions or alternatives are being evaluated, right?
Yeah.
And that entire picture and modeling, I think, is what's important to ensure that whatever you are going to implement, it makes sense from your business environment and it's nimble enough to change because the rules are uncertain and will change, right?
Yeah. And it's also an opportunity, Dot, right, to completely agree with the modeling, to see where can we improve service and performance. So what are the opportunities, right? I think it's somewhat of the opportunity to do that at the same time.
Yep. And what is your business drivers? What is your business goals you're wanting to achieve, right?
Yeah.
What are your pitfalls or what are your roadblocks? And then those are all written up and modeled so that the decision makers have those facts in hand to make an informed decision that's going to impact the core of its operations.
Yeah, yeah.
And something that I see from a trade and customs perspective is, you know, David, you were saying often if trade and customs doesn't report into tax, sometimes they do, sometimes they report into legal, sometimes they report into supply chain. There's all kinds of, there is no sort of one basic model as to where customs and trade people report up in a company. But it's been my experience, especially in Canada, less so in the United States, but more so in Canada, that there are no in-house customs and trade people. And I know that there's people on the line today because I looked at the registration list before I got on. I know there are some of you on the line and I know that I know some of you. But for a lot of companies out there, they rely upon their customs broker. And I myself am a licensed customs broker. However, the only analogy that I can give to sort of, you know, if you go to an outside company to get your personal tax return done, they crank it out. They're in the business of high volume, just get it done. They're not necessarily like the proverbial, you know, I don't want to mention a company, but I think you get who I mean. They're not in the business of strategy. So for a lot of companies who say, I don't have an in-house trade and customs person, I rely upon my customs broker. The customs broker is there to exercise and to actually execute particular transactions to make sure your supply chain continues to move.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not necessarily at the table with this kind of level of strategic comprehensiveness. And I don't say that as any sort of, you know, degradation of the customs brokers. I consider myself one. That's just the reality of it. So for companies that don't have this expertise in-house, you know, that's really something that you need to think about, because those nuances now, and especially that these rules are more complex than ever, and the world of trade has gotten to be far more complicated than I've ever seen it in my 35 years. And I remember when Ross Perot was talking about, you know, great big sucking sounds and all the jobs were going to go to Mexico. I've been around for a long time. I've never seen this level of trade instability around the rules. The WTO, the WCO, the WTO right now does not have an adjudication panel. First time, I mean, you know, the WCO is looking at digital tax and what that could potentially do. E-commerce is changing the way a lot of the rules that have been in place since the Second World War that have been stable and kind of bedrock, all of those things now are changing. So, and if you don't have somebody on staff in-house with that kind of in-depth understanding, I think that's another challenge for some companies. So we're at 10 minutes to go. So I'd like to sort of turn it over to some Q&A. I've got some questions here that have come in while we're waiting for hopefully some additional people. So somebody asked the question, what provisions does CUSMA have for Canadian manufacturers who have plants in the US and Mexico in terms of export, import, and supply chain resilience and taxes? So that's a very wide question. CUSMA expects, like just from the trade agreement alone, the trade agreement was structured in such a way, like all free trade agreements are, to encourage manufacturing in any of the parties that are subject to the free trade agreement. So in this particular case, the rules were written to make it advantageous for companies to manufacture in Canada, the US, or Mexico. And what this particular negotiation did is it tightened the existing NAFTA rules to make it almost painful to manufacture at the subcomponent level outside of North America. It's still possible, but that was the intent, right? The intent of the free trade agreement was to pull those jobs back to North America from Asia and other places. But then, you know, I'm going to turn from a tax perspective. So outside of CUSMA, you know, supply chain from a legislative and regulatory standpoint, import, export, all that sort of thing, you know, David, Dott, I know you've already spoken on it, but that's really those provisions that kick in as to whether or not it makes sense to do business in a particular place. I'm thinking value chain, David.
Yeah, no, exactly. So it's a combination of many different things. So if you just look at the tax implications of doing business across North America, I mean, you have domestic tax legislation in Canada, the US, and Mexico. You also have tax treaties in place between all of those countries. And what tax treaties are doing is they're aimed at eliminating double taxation, which means that if you operate in more than one country, you're always potentially subjected to the fact that both tax authorities, as I mentioned before, will disagree on where you report taxes. And so there are some fairly robust and tried, tested, and true mechanisms between those two countries, those three countries, that would prevent or provide like a forum where you can resolve the disputes over double taxation. So you're almost guaranteed to only be paying tax once in one country on the same item of income. So that's pretty robust. The other tax aspect that, you know, I would say we didn't really touch upon, which are very important here too, is as companies assess what they ought to be doing to sort of, you know, qualify for some of the CUSMA requirements and potentially relocate certain functions or activities from outside of, say, North America to North America. I think where we see a lot of traction is working hand in hand with supply chain to say, look, if we make the decision that it may be interesting to consider as a scenario to bring back operations in Canada, the US, or Mexico, then there's this whole issue about, you know, how do we identify the most efficient location from a supply chain perspective, also from a tax perspective. So what are the subsidies that are available? What are the tax incentives that are available? Can I get a tax holiday for certain types of taxes and so on and so forth? So that's that tends to be a much more local sort of layer of taxes. I mean, if you're looking at bringing something back to the states, you know, you may have the state, you may have the county, you may have the city. So that makes it a much more sort of comprehensive analysis. And once again, if you're making those key decisions, you want to make the right decision that makes sense from a supply chain perspective. It has to fit with your network analysis. It has to fit from a tax perspective, financial, a labor perspective. So that's where we get our sources of tax legislation or information.
Yep, and the other thing on the income tax treaties is that although it tries to minimize the amount of taxation or double tax between the three countries in North America, it also has certain types of income that's what is the minimum level of tax that underlying country can do. So for your dividends, your interest, your royalties, and so forth. So there's some minimum amount of tax that will be done in the country in which the value is derived. And so they've done both, right? To try and not erode the base, but at the same time to provide some certainty on certain types of income that you can plan accordingly.
So the next question is for Jérôme, where Jérôme, you mentioned that some demand signals are changing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what do you think they're changing to is the question. I know what I'm seeing is like from just in time to just in case in many circumstances, but I'll let you elaborate.
Yeah, and it's a very good question, and it's more related to the COVID situation than it is to the CUSMA situation, obviously. I mean, what we've seen changing is consumer behavior, right? So, in terms of period of uncertainty, and we also restarting a little bit cold the supply chain in the auto industry, as you mentioned earlier. We've been put at a stop, some distribution center completely closed down. So we, obviously our colleagues, industry colleagues on the phone knows that better, but we have inventory. So I guess what we're trying to say is the demand signal are changing due to first, from an OEM standpoint, consumer behavior changing, or uncertainty brings a different type of buying pattern. We're restarting the supply chain post-COVID, or still in COVID, but say post the hard stop of COVID. So which line and which type of parts needs to be pushed? In other words, the typical frozen time horizon we have with the OEM doesn't apply really. So as an example of that, we've been working with organization to somewhat bypass the ERP typical forecasting process, who takes 4 to 6 weeks as a cycle, in order to bring what we call intelligent forecasting, which is really a machine learning AI view of the data, both from the historical, from the ERP, but also adding a number of external trigger points, like web services from consumer behavior in retail, web services and data from the weather forecast, and some other information, in order to find some correlation and help, if you will, moving into somewhat of a greater accuracy of the forecast and the demand. So that's what I meant. Hopefully that gives an answer to the question that's been asked, but that's what I meant.
And Jérôme,
sorry, go ahead, Dot.
Jérôme, one of the things I've seen in the consumer behavior, at least in probably the dealerships that I see here in Texas, because I happen to be down here at the moment, is that there is, because of COVID, the manufacturing of new cars has shut down or has been significantly limited, that there's been now a shift to the used car auctions. And so a significant number of dealerships and consumers are having to go to that avenue at the moment, which plays into kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, yeah.
And what I was going to say is one of the things that we didn't really talk about a lot during this particular webinar, and we've got a minute or two left here, so we're about to wrap up, is the demands of the OEMs. So, I mean, this webinar today, we're talking to the parts manufacturers, but the reality is the Fords, the Chryslers, the GMs, the Hondas, the Toyotas, the Volkswagens, the actual OEMs of the world are also facing very much a new reality. And some of the demands that they're going to be pushing down on their supply chain, it's akin to like consumer behavior, right? So consumer behavior is going to drive the OEMs. The OEMs are going to drive the people who are listening on this particular call. So I think that there's still some, the shifting and the change has not yet come to a conclusion.
Yeah, and I can see the next question is exactly about this, right? So maybe I can take a peek at the first half of this question, here, which is whether the OEM are pushing this down to tier 1, tier 2 in order to figure this out. Most of the time, yeah, we can expect that to happen. And we've seen that with some of our clients, in fact. It's basically in your hands to figure out how to deal with this new reality and the imperfect plan, I will say, provided by the OEM for the reason we mentioned earlier. So it goes back to really understanding, having some modeling in place, and I can think about some of our clients who actually put in place kind of a SWAT team who are doing ongoing modeling, like not within a month or within 6 months, but like almost weekly, in order to anticipate what could potentially happen and redirect, course redirect, if you will, their production plan or sourcing. And I know it looks like a lot of work, but up to a point where we'll go back to something that is a little more predictable from a demand standpoint. And I will encourage, specifically if you have volume, anyone on this call to actually think about that.
Yeah, and I know that what's some OEMs are also sort of talking to the parts manufacturers about is that $16 an hour US labor requirement. Technically speaking, when you look at the rules under CUSMA, that's really an OEM requirement, but as part of the supply chain, the OEMs are talking to the parts manufacturers and sort of trying to push that down. So the final question, is technical from a customs perspective. Does, the Annex 99 apply to automotive parts under CAD? Yes. So Section 99, Chapter 99 in the Canadian tariff does speak to and alleviate duties on parts. So but I think the main takeaway message here is that what we're talking about here, I see the biggest risk in companies that pay 0 duties a year, because if you are paying 0 duties a year based on a condition, right? I'm using Chapter 99, my goods qualify for NAFTA. So there's a reason why I'm not paying duty. The underlying truth is that there's duty that's there, but you're taking advantage of some sort of condition to render yourself duty free. That is what is, to speak to and to echo David and Dot earlier, tax authorities around the world are all fighting for that same dollar, and there is more of a focus by all governments right now to ensure that you do indeed meet the condition. So there's 2 things I would say. Just because things are duty free doesn't mean that it's risk free. That's the wrong paradigm. That's not an appropriate paradigm. And then the other thing that I'll say is, even if you apply Chapter 99 in Canada to get your goods duty free, is that going to meet your customer, your OEM, whoever you're selling to? Is your customer demanding of you that your goods qualify for a free trade agreement? The fact that you brought them in duty free, if they don't qualify for the free trade agreement, could actually impact your ability to sell into the marketplace and stuff, because now this is, as we've been saying all the way through this webinar, this free trade agreement was structured in such a way to make the goods be manufactured in North America. It's not a duty-free thing, it's manufactured in North America is the main focus. So I'll leave it there, and I will thank everyone for, Flavio is still on the line. I don't know if he's still with us or not, but I'll sort of leave it there. We've answered the questions. We are at the top of the hour. We're actually 3 minutes over. So I thank everyone for tuning in. I thank APMA for the opportunity. You heard Flavio say earlier that we're going to be giving courses. The very first set of courses are meant for people who know nothing about free trade agreements, and we're going to start at the very beginning, because I think for a lot of tax professionals, based on what we said today, I think it would probably be a good exercise to actually learn how to interpret the free trade agreement without having to worry about becoming a trade geek like myself. But I think it's important to understand what's actually in this new piece of legislation. So I encourage you to watch the APMA website, look for those courses. I'll be the one giving it. And Dot, Jérôme, David, and APMA, thank you so much for your time and your input today. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day all.